Welcome to the Screen MDM Talks podcast hosted by me, Mancha Daswani. This week our sponsor is MD Media Biz.
Hello, welcome to the Screen MDM Talks podcast. I'm Mancha Daswani, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here with Kris Imai, who's the head of the international business at Unext in Japan. Hi, Kris.
Hello, Mancha. I love how you slipped into your British accent for a little bit for our global audience, but you
You
can
know,
bring
it
out the
happens.
Bronx
It
later
comes
on.
goes. I'm
Yeah,
a woman of the world, Kris. You
there
know.
you are.
Now, as you well know, I do have readers, viewers from around the world. So let's set this up for those who may not be in the know about the really unique position that Unext has carved for itself in Japan. Tell us about that.
Okay, thank you. And really great to speak to you. So yeah, Unixed is that little Japanese platform that nobody knows outside of Japan because it's fiercely domestic. It's not internationally available in any form. But we are pretty big in terms of the global, market. For example, specifically, in terms of our market share, there's Netflix and there's us. So just to give you an idea of the scale, we're coming up about close to 5 million subscribers. Again, being fiercely domestic, it's kind of refreshing in the sense that we don't have any overarching international strategy that we had to hear to. We can kind of make the decisions, as dictated by the local market needs. So we are Japanese platform designed for Japanese, designed by Japanese. And it's lovely in the sense that if there's a good opportunity, if there's content that makes sense, if there's a strategy that makes sense, we can just jump on it. So that I think is the kind of unique positioning. Yes, we are owned by a holdings company, but ultimately a lot of the content strategy, programming strategy are dictated by solely market needs, the local market, and we kind of run with it that way.
Sure. So, I mean, you were at Fox before, and at the time you were acquiring for a regional audience, and it was cable channels, which I think we all just kind of engaged with in a different way in terms of our discovery and such. Now, as a person now who's in the middle of a career pivot, I'm really curious to talk to people about just sort of shifts in your own internal thinking that you have to do when you go from one place to another. You went from programming a suite of very successful cable channels for an entire region to being at an SVOD operator in a very unique, very specific Asia Pac market. Tell me about just some of the mental shifts that you had to make to go from one end to the other of
Sure.
serving audiences.
So again, there's a couple of things, right? I mean, one, yes, pan-regional. I mean, I think my career was teased out in two parts, right? Part was Asia Pac, pan-regional, another part was solely Japan. But I mean, in terms of going from a pan-regional to fiercely local platform and stuff like it, obviously it's just a lot more straightforward. When you're programming for pan-regional, you're obviously trying to take, the lowest common denominator to some extent. What's going to rate in Malaysia is not going to rate in Singapore. So we're trying to find a mix of balance because you have one single feed. And there are sacrifices, obviously, but you kind of balance out the programming. You find, certain content, certain time slots. The biggest shift, to be honest with you, is shifting from a linear dynamic into, an on-demand platform. Yes, it comes with its own specific sets of similarities in terms of programming strategies. Obviously, we have to keep thinking of a person's, lifestyle, what they're going to watch in the morning, what they're going to watch in the afternoon. But obviously, you're providing the illusion of choice, but making sure that you're programming it in a way that it's easily, receptible. So if I'm going to just dump a whole bunch of content, to be very cognizant of okay, when is someone going to consume, how, when, how am I staggering things? So it's interesting, when I first jumped into from a cable industry, linear industry into OTT, I was, frankly, perplexed, right? Well, what? Anyone could just search, for any title. It's well, actually, no, a lot of the similar principles in terms of understanding what a person wants to consume, when, how often, and stuff apply. It's obviously not linear scheduling, but it is very important to me making sure that if we have this gigantic inventory of video streaming content, we need to make sure that every single content that we acquire and program has its moment in the sunshine, and that we're actually targeting each individual taste and not just doing it via an algorithm, but implying a lot of human, efforts as well in order to make sure that
Yeah.
content reaches the right audience. So
Right.
that's
No, that's
the shift from
interesting.
linear to OTT. But I mean, in terms of I think that honestly the biggest is from studio to, local. And again, this has been probably the most refreshing. And I recommend anyone who's lost in the studio world and the uncertainty of what's going on and stuff like that, just seriously consider domestic, opportunities, because it's not just about an underdog situation. It's about seeing potential, right? And especially if
Yeah.
we're talking about the really big shift from, let's say Hollywood content in terms of like the audience share for really true domestic product, obviously there's something to be done there. And I think we've
Mm,
seen examples in different countries like Indonesia and India, of course. We're seeing in Korea, especially as well, where we're seeing fierce competition from these local domestic platforms against
yeah.
globals like Netflix or Disney Plus.
Yeah. So, I mean, let's get into that. Obviously, Unext has an incredibly compelling local offer of fantastic content. How are you looking at the international market? Is it mostly, the big studio deals? Is it mostly American? Give us a sense of what's guiding your overall international
Sure.
approach.
So, as many, or I don't know, I mean, right now in Japan, and this is not dissimilar to a number of other markets, we're facing, unfortunately, a shrinking appetite for Western content.
Mm,
When we're talking about either US series or even Hollywood films, the box office numbers in Japan, I mean, it's almost only, domestic product. And to that extent, it's only domestic anime product that's really hitting the top 10.
yeah.
Similarly, for US series, I mean, before like 20 years ago, when we had this really thriving DVD business, you would see
Mm,
like, shows like 24 or Lost on free to air terrestrial. Right now, there is none of that. And when we're looking at like, let's say Google
mm,
search engines or general like, interest in US series, we're seeing a decline.
yeah.
So trying to fight and and then combat that kind of tide is really critical to our strategy. We do
Mm,
believe in the strength. There's arguably a lot stronger premium content out there on the market, especially from the Hollywood studios right now. I mean, first and foremost, we need to curb that shrinking appetite, and we
mm,
need to get probably the strongest IP, the strongest cast. I mean, really, really isolating into looking into like, okay, what's really going to move the dial in terms of generating interest and resuscitating kind of like, an appetite for Western content. So
yeah.
to be honest with you, right now, in terms of content strategy
Mm,
for Western, we're trying to take as much as possible. But at the same time, we're honing in onto those, specific IPs and those programs that are really going to generate new subs, without having to like watch an entire first episode. You're going to be like, okay, let me check that out. That's really kind of the
yeah.
overall criteria. Because again, like I would love to buy everything like, from your indie art house to your, non-English language, content as well. Right now is unfortunately not the right time for us.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that we have the HBO distribution. There's a lot of amazing, strong content coming through the pipeline. We want to make sure that first and foremost, we're not just placating to an ever shrinking audience of like US series fans, but really
Yes.
broadening that reach as wide as possible, curb that trend, and then ultimately then look at flexing out more and like really invigorating and kind of multiplying the programming inventory so that it's like satisfying even wider range of tastes. So really long way of answering your question, but ultimately yes, we're really focusing on Hollywood, kind of like the most premium content right now. I think once
Sure.
we get to a bigger scale and ultimately have a larger reach, then we can start expanding into more niche product.
Right. No, that makes sense. In terms of the shrinking appetite for American content, though, and they talked about this at APOS a little bit a couple months ago. Um, how do you stem that tide? There is so much fantastic content coming out of your home market, plus what's happening in Korea, plus everywhere else. Beautiful European dramas. There is so much to access. Getting through to customers is so difficult, just getting them to discover something. Tell me a little bit about sort of how your team at UNEG, you and your marketing team and your suppliers are sort of collaborating on that, whether it's bringing talent or having a smart social strategy. What do you have to do now to really help these already well known, but not necessarily well known in Japan properties cut through today?
Yep. Excellent question. And the hypothesis that the content is strong. The content is great. If you watch it, you will be hooked and you'll become a fan. The problem is visibility.
Yeah.
You could argue that, a person in their 20s in Japan has never seen a US series, for example.
Mm,
They've never had the opportunity
yeah.
to watch Friends or ER or something like that, right? And
Mm,
there's good evidence to suggest that aggressive sampling, either on social, either on, even free to air linear,
Yeah.
that helps drive visibility, obviously, because it's present, right? Japan has been a historically pay-averse culture where people are more than
Yeah.
happy to watch, free to air linear or just YouTube UGC content and never in
Mhm.
between.
Right.
The kind of hurdles in getting past the paywall are still present, right?
Yeah.
I think like the average user
Mm.
in Japan subscribes to like 1.7 platforms, whereas like in the US it's like well above 3, I think. So
Yeah, US
there's
actually
obviously
is 6.
it's
According to
6.
Grace Notes, it's 6.
Wow.
It's
Okay.
mad.
So yeah, we're a third of the way there basically, right? So it's
Yep.
like, I've got Amazon and I've got something else basically. So that's
Yeah.
a challenge, but ultimately opportunity as well. So what we're trying, and this is again not just a Unext burden, but we're trying to convince our partners as well to be out of the box, a lot more aggressive in terms of free sampling, in terms of like looking into opportunities where it doesn't have to be like, a short burst of like, hey, let's put up a show for like, the pilot episode for like 30 days in preparation for like the new season. We should go
Mm.
back further. Like again, what if we sample, for example, like the entire first season of ER, right? For free. Just
Exactly.
to kind
Yeah.
of like look at, like really clearly strong IP. Like, oh, okay, US series are interesting. Build up an appetite, build
Mm.
up an audience for that, and ultimately helping to, turn that tide a little bit.
Yeah.
That's on social. We're looking at, a lot of clipping. Let's be honest, like, all the efforts that we put into, like, marketing on social, some person in their basement, cutting up like, clips of Good Doctor and stuff will probably do infinitely a better job. So we're trying hopefully to, engage with a lot of influencers locally.
Yep.
But then again, we haven't cracked it yet. We don't own the rights outside, like in perpetuity for some of the content that we
Yeah.
license. We license for a specific, window and a
Sure.
specific set of rights, but we're trying to convince us like, okay, something has to be done, right? To kind of
Yeah.
curb this shrinking appetite. And
Sure.
we've talked to, some kind of, like-minded partners in Australia and Korea as well, and they're all thinking in the same
Mm.
lines in the sense that it's about visibility. It's always been about visibility, right? If we're extending it to like, different social issues as well, it's about visibility. You get that visibility out there, you're going to find an audience. That audience is going to
Yeah.
grow, and you're going to ultimately open up the door for a lot more interesting content to come through.
Sure. No, that's interesting. No, been spending a lot of time on data recently because I'm building a platform, a website, a newsletter, and I want it all to be based on really good tech that can deliver the data that I need to understand what readers want, and that can deliver the numbers that our clients want. So obviously, you have a ton of analytics from your own service, which is brilliant. But how do you sort of balance that? Here are the numbers, but here's my gut sense of what I think is a really good show that's gonna play to my audience well. How are you navigating that as a programmer today?
Good question. I'll admit I'm a bit of a luddite, so I leave the smart analytics to the smart gentlemen and ladies in my company. But in all seriousness, we value data tremendously, right?
Yeah,
And we're looking at retention. We're looking at what's driving new subs. Obviously, yes, we're in terms of bottom line revenue, like what is going to be like driving new acquisitions of subscribers, kind of like
right.
really really tenement, and ultimately that's going to be dwarfed by anime, local content, Korea content, sports, not the Western side. So in terms of what I'm faced with, really, out of a, it's not a bubble, but I mean, it is a fairly like niche, genre.
Mm,
Out of this, what do I feel potentially is the most, cutthroat, easy to digest, easy to, promote and that, looking for those different criteria and those elements. But
yeah.
again, like, extending that web a lot wider. So I'm using, research in terms of like, the Google Analytics. I'm partnering with our, web marketing team, and it's really driving click rates. And, out of like just a short thumbnail or even just like a short
Mhm.
clip and what's moving that dial, building up, enough confidence to finally like figure out like what the right criteria is. But then again, I'm
Yeah.
coming from about like, 20 plus years of experience in the industry. So I have an idea of what a Japanese people might want to watch. The problem was, I think, when we're talking about my experience with Fox, we were so involved in this bubble, right? And it's like, great, the ratings shot up within Fox channel, but that's also, again, like a shrinking group of people that were always die
Yeah.
fans. Now, okay, how am I looking to target, like, let's say an anime fan or a Korean drama
Mm.
fan? Those are really challenging,
That's interesting.
opportunities
Yeah.
where, a person who, subscribes to Unext and watch Korean dramas, they don't want to watch anything else except for Korean dramas, right?
Yeah.
How do I subtly like kind of like pull them in? So we've done things like enlisting, let's say, like top class anime talent, voice
Mm.
the dubs for some of our US series to hopefully bring in some other anime,
Yeah.
talent.
Yeah.
Or sorry, anime fans. But for me, in terms of the criteria, it's really
Mm.
just again, like, balancing out, okay, what historically has been working. Generally speaking, it's kind of, the knowns, right? We know, for example, Last of Us, Walking Dead is going to really, really perform really well on this
Yeah.
on the platform. Every once in a while, there's an outliers, that was like, okay, that's interesting. Maybe we could figure out some angle for here. We know, for example, like medical procedurals do better than legal procedurals, and that might be different from platform to platform. For
Oh,
example, the Hulu demographic is quite different from the Unix demographic.
yeah.
So we're looking at them in detail and stuff like that, but ultimately the conclusions that are being made are pretty much in line with what we had thought, was going to happen. So right
Yeah.
now it is not, I mean, lowest common denominator is not the best way to describe it, but ultimately like the really, really core, criteria for what makes a show attractive and sexy and hot and pop and stuff like that.
Now, looking ahead to next year, it's a weird time in the business. I feel like there's not a lot of clarity for people right now. I think people just seem worried, scared. The business is changing so much. What are some of the things that you're just remaining focused on as your primary consideration as you serve your audiences with great content? What are the
Yeah.
things that you're remaining focused on?
Honestly, for us, it's all about scaling up. And to do that, we need to provide, the most premium, experience possible, whether that's new
Yeah.
services, whether that's better content, strategic acquisitions, all of that,
Mm.
right? I think for us, and again, as we grow and grow aggressively in comparison to globals and other platforms in Japan, it's not the time to relax at all.
Yeah.
We're about to hit 5 million subscribers. If anything, it's the time to really be aggressive in scaling up. So for that purpose is where I'm focusing mostly on. And again, like the international business covers a wide scope and sports is a big part of that as well. Is like, okay,
Okay.
what sports are really going to drive the service? What are we looking for in terms of like not just placating existing, subscribers, but bringing in a new
Mm.
set of subscribers as well. Different demographics. Obviously the more difficult ones are the people who have never, bought into like a pay service. The lower hanging fruit
Yeah.
might be people from other services as well. Figuring out those strategic means
Mm.
and what kind of content is going to drive that. So the last half year has been a lot of more bigger deals, let's say, and then in terms of like scouting the market and finding like different series, it's just been about like more strategic investments.
Right.
But
No,
for
that
the
makes sense.
international side, I mean, again, like you have to understand. I mean, we're the exclusive distributor of HBO Max in the territory. There's a lot of excellent content coming through the pipeline. We've just launched, Welcome to Derry, which did tremendously well. And again, that's a great example of like, okay, strong IP. The movie did well in Japan. People know about it. There's a horror fan base, which is usually pretty loyal and enthusiastic. No
Yeah.
brainer, right? That's going to bring in new subscribers. That's going to like really, really resuscitate, hopefully, the interest in US series, even though it's a more,
Sure.
niche horror genre still. So I think it's right now in terms of the Western content, figuring out how to really, curate it better. Making sure that
Mm.
we're marketing effectively. We're not, actively looking again. Like if something comes out, then yes, we're always, on the ground to figure out how to acquire that. But what are the
Yeah.
strongest IPs? What is really going to move the dial? How are we
Yeah.
allocating those market energies and resources to really fully make sure that as many people see it as possible?
Right. What are you doing in the sports space? And then sort of outside drama and comedy, what are you doing?
We've been very aggressive in
Yeah.
this scope. You mentioned the Premier League. We're on their second season of a 7-season exclusive deal for you next.
Wow.
This is huge because obviously there's a
Wow.
gigantic fan base. There's a lot of amazing Japanese athletes like Mitoma playing in the Premier League. All of our sports acquisitions are driven by what's going to be relevant in Japan. So we're not
Yeah.
looking at American football, for example, but certainly we are looking at golf. We've locked in like the 4 major golf tournaments, exclusively to Unext.
Mm.
MMA and also fight sports. We have UFC locked in. We've got ATP and tennis. So we've got these core pillars that are really hyper relevant to Japan. The only exception
Yeah.
being, baseball, which is generally, available everywhere else.
Right.
But for MMA, for European football, for tennis, and then for golf, we've got a locked in good
Wow.
set, and that's really I mean, I
Wow.
can't understate enough, or sorry, overstate enough how important that is to driving subscriptions. And then in terms of
And
other genres, again, right now our focus is on what's going to drive subs. So
sure.
the more retention, content, we're still obviously, open for business. It's just
Yeah.
not a huge priority at the moment. However,
Yeah.
kids is huge, right? We have an entirely dedicated team solely to this business, which is either like, curating the kids zone, producing original kids content, producing original kids books, you know, kids is different, right? You
Yeah.
can't tell a 4-year-old and stuff like that, here's this great new series that you've never heard of. It's got to be something that they've already watched on YouTube and can
Yeah.
point their finger and see like, okay, I want this show. So
Yeah.
very, very different way of, figuring out how to acquire content. A brand new
Sure.
series from, an external, vendor and stuff like that is going to take a lot of work in terms of marketing, promoting. But that's where, again, the social element comes in. I
Mhm.
like how, the approach that a lot of our kids, partners do is like just
Mm.
putting a ton on YouTube, driving, views through ads, making sure that within this YouTube ecosystem, it's like you're really doing well. Similarly to like, when a lot of distributors, buy slots on terrestrial, right? On NHK or
Yeah.
different, free to air channels and put a kids, Paw Patrol is an excellent example, right?
Yeah.
Where, it was on terrestrial. It was a consortium agreement between multiple parties. They made a ton of money, and ultimately that awareness went through the roof. And Paw Patrol
Yeah.
is arguably no longer a Western IP for the Japanese kids
Right.
audience. It's ranking up there in terms of like, alongside of like pure Japanese animation, which is great. So
Yeah.
there is that potential. So again, kids is really
Uh,
important, but I mean, to
yeah.
what extent are people subscribing because we have the non-exclusive, kids content on the platform? Probably less so, but ultimately it is
Yeah.
really important to our strategy. I think, we're never ignoring anything. It's just shifting of priorities right now. But like in terms of like, let's say like unscripted content, again, it depends on like, the caliber. Like, let's say like a blue chip
Yeah.
documentary and stuff like it is obviously going to generate a lot of ratings. But in deference to like in terms of driving subs, less so obviously, just
Yeah.
because of the virtue of
Sure.
the genre. There are those opportunities where again, like, we look at something that's going to be really locally relevant, right? And let's say there's a piece that happened to feature some, Japanese businessmen, or it happened to be like a Japanese scandal that was featured in this documentary, then we'd go for that definitely. Just because,
Yeah.
again, every little thing we can to do to make it like more and more relevant to our audiences, I think is really critical.
Sure. So then would you be looking at co-production opportunities in spaces like that, where if it were a Japanese story that an international platform wanted to tell the story of, that you could partner with someone globally and co-produce
Absolutely,
rather than
absolutely,
green light? Yeah.
yeah. Again, like we're a Japanese company. We don't have the scale of a Netflix, where we can aggregate costs across multiple territories. We're limited, so the decisions
Yeah.
we make in terms of originals and investment stuff like that,
Mhm.
it's we're pretty judicious. But we are, again, getting to 5 million subscribers. We're now at that stage, I think, where we can start producing in greater volume. Right before
Sure.
we were mostly consortium agreements, either a minority share. Now we're taking on bigger and
Yeah.
bigger projects that are really pushed by you next.
That's fascinating. How are you looking at vertical video and creator economy content as a marketing opportunity, as a telling opportunity? What's your perspective there?
We're looking into it. We're not, fully convinced yet in terms of, again, we're operating behind a paywall, right?
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a different, environment where it doesn't necessarily play immediately into that subscriber base.
Sure.
I don't I mean, I obviously it's a juggernaut of a business and we recognize that
Yeah.
it's incredibly lucrative. What are we looking at in terms of the IP that we fully own? Are we looking to, use it as a promotional and marketing tool? Those are all things that are definitely under consideration. We haven't made any specific, movements yet to announce, but to be continued.
Brilliant. Chris, was there anything else about what's going on at you next that you wanted to tell me about that I have not asked you about yet?
And like literally when people are asking about like what are you doing with AVOD right now, for example, we don't have any ad supported tier. Are we looking at that? This
Yeah.
business changes, like that, right? I mean, I don't know what next year is going to bring. It's nice
No
to be
idea.
always on your toes. I have never said no to any opportunity unless we've done our due diligence. I don't have a 5, 10 year like strategy because the business is
Yeah.
so dynamic and fluid. So it's just exciting, honestly. For us,
Yeah.
it's a double-edged sword in the sense that like, we're growing really fast, we're definitely a target, so we need to be,
Yeah.
future-proofed as possible. But at the same time, it's good to be in a growth business. It's good to be in an environment where we are, making strides against these global platforms. And then hopefully, we can come up with something totally unique. Again, like just by virtue of
Yeah.
the fact that we don't have a global strategy. Like if a good opportunity comes up and it's on the table, then let's go for it. And that's the
Sure.
kind of, I guess, I don't know, not necessarily startup mentality, but at least we have that flexibility to, look outside the box, in terms of, new opportunities that are going to drive the business
Yeah,
forward.
right.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Well, Kris, thank you for being part of my first series of guests on Screen MDM
My
Talks. I
pleasure.
really appreciate it. And hopefully, I will see you in person again very soon.
Thanks for listening to the Screen MDM Talks podcast hosted by me, Mantra Daswani. Kate Roach is our VP of Global Ad Sales and Business Development. Production was done by Anand Patel. Musical score performed and composed by Jahan Raymond.